Welcome back to Scary Stories, where we explore the eerie and unknown. Tonight, we're diving into the legend of the Bell Witch, one of America's most chilling and mysterious hauntings. For over 200 years, tales of a vengeful spirit have haunted Tennessee's dark woods and terrified all who dare to listen. So, turn off the lights, sit back, and prepare yourself. The Bell family lived a quiet and peaceful life in the rural countryside of Adams, Tennessee, in the early 19th century. John Bell, the patriarch, was a well-respected farmer who had moved to the area with his wife Lucy and their children, hoping to build a prosperous and serene life. Their farmhouse, nestled among sprawling fields and towering trees, seemed like the perfect place to raise a family. Little did they know, something far darker lurked beneath the calm surface of their lives. It was in 1817 when strange things began to occur on the Bell property. At first, the signs were subtle and easy to dismiss. John would occasionally see odd animals wandering near the edges of his fields, creatures he couldn't quite identify, their forms shifting and unnatural. He spotted what looked like a large dog with a rabbit's head, and another time, a bird too large for the region perched in a tree. These sightings left him uneasy, but he chalked them up to tricks of the mind, refusing to believe anything was truly wrong. Soon, however, the strange events escalated beyond harmless wildlife. The first real sign of trouble came when John Bell began hearing odd sounds around the farmhouse. At night, the walls creaked and groaned in ways that didn't seem natural, like the wood itself was trying to speak. The noise of knocking echoed through the rooms, and sometimes it seemed like chains were being dragged across the floor, though nothing was ever found out of place. It wasn't long before the rest of the family began to notice these sounds as well. The Bell children, especially young Betsy, started waking up terrified, claiming they heard faint whispering in their ears while they slept. Lucy Bell, though skeptical at first, could no longer deny that something was very wrong when she too began hearing unexplained sounds, as though someone or something was watching them from just beyond their sight. One evening, as the family sat around their dinner table, a loud, sharp knock came from the front door. John, thinking it might be a late visitor or a neighbor in need, got up to answer it, only to find no one there. The knock came again, this time from the back door, but once again, there was no one in sight. The third knock came from inside the house itself. The family sat frozen in fear, unable to explain how this could be happening. They had begun to realize that something far more sinister than a prank was at play. Over the next few days, the haunting sounds grew louder and more frequent. It was as though the house had come alive with a presence that couldn't be seen, but was undeniably there. The walls echoed with strange voices, doors creaked open and shut on their own, and footsteps could be heard pacing through empty rooms. Yet, whenever the family tried to investigate, they found nothing. It was as though an invisible force had taken up residence in their home, and it wasn't going to leave anytime soon. John Bell, being a man of faith and reason, sought to keep his family calm, reassuring them that there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps it was the wind or some natural phenomena, but deep down, he knew better. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and no amount of reason could explain away the growing terror they felt each night. Despite his outward calm, he couldn't shake the creeping fear that this presence had come for him. Specifically, the once tranquil Bell home had become a place of dread. No longer able to ignore the strange happenings, John confided in a close neighbor, seeking advice on what to do. But the neighbor had no solutions. Word began to spread in the small community that the Bell family was experiencing something otherworldly, though few believed it at first. After all, who would believe that a house could be haunted by something invisible, something so relentless and violent? The days passed, but the entity showed no sign of leaving, The family could no longer sleep through the night, as the knocking, the scratching sounds, and the heavy footsteps never ceased. It was as if the entity wanted them to know was always there, lurking just beyond the edge of their understanding, waiting for something darker yet to come. As the weeks wore on, the Bell family found themselves slipping into a state of constant fear and exhaustion. They had no idea what the entity wanted, but they knew it wasn't going to leave on its own. Whatever this presence was, it had taken root in their home, and they were helpless to stop it. The Bell Witch had arrived, and the nightmare was only beginning. As the days turned into weeks, the Bell family's quiet farmhouse became a place of escalating fear and confusion. What had begun as strange noises and eerie disturbances quickly transformed into something far more aggressive. It seemed the entity, whatever it was growing stronger. No longer content with simply haunting the house, it began to physically target the family, with a particular focus on John Bell and his young daughter, Betsy. The first signs of the entity's more dangerous nature emerged when Betsy started to experience strange sensations at night. At first, it felt like gentle taps on her skin, like someone lightly flicking her arm. She tried to ignore it, thinking it was nothing more than her imagination. But soon, these sensations grew into something much more alarming. She would wake up in the middle of the night to the feeling of her hair being yanked, her bed covers ripped off, or an invisible hand slapping her face. These attacks left her terrified and helpless, but they were just the beginning. As Betsy's torment grew, so did the malevolent presence in the house. Objects that once sat quietly on shelves would now fly across the room without warning, smashing into walls or crashing to the floor. Chairs would tip over by themselves, and dishes would shatter for no apparent reason. The invisible force seemed to revel in causing chaos, as if it found joy in making the Bell family live in constant fear. John Bell, too, was not spared from the entity's wrath. One morning, as he was working in the fields, he felt a sudden sharp pain in his face, as though he had been struck by an unseen hand. He stumbled, clutching his cheek, but when he looked around, there was no one there. This mysterious attack repeated itself several times over the coming weeks. John would be walking through his home or tending to his land when, without warning, he would feel the sting of an invisible force hitting him. Sometimes it was a slap, other times a violent push that nearly knocked him off his feet. The relentless torment began to take its toll on the entire family. Betsy, once a bright and lively girl, became withdrawn and fearful. She spent her days in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing when the next attack would come. Her schoolwork suffered, and she became too frightened to sleep alone at night, often seeking comfort in her parents' room. The stress weighed heavily on John and Lucy Bell as well, as they watched their daughter suffer and felt powerless to stop it. Despite their growing desperation, the Bell family tried to maintain some sense of normalcy. They continued their daily routines, farming, cooking, and tending to the household, hoping that by ignoring the entity, it might go away. But the more they ignored it, the more aggressive it seemed to become. The Bell children, especially Betsy, were often targeted while they slept. On one particularly terrifying night, Betsy awoke to find herself being lifted from her bed by an unseen force. She screamed in terror, and her parents rushed to her room, only to find her suspended in midair, her body thrashing as if being held by an invisible grip. As soon as John and Lucy entered the room, Betsy was dropped back onto her bed, gasping for breath and trembling with fear. There was no explanation for what had just happened, no way to rationalize the nightmare their daughter was living through. The attacks didn't stop with Betsy. Other members of the household also began experiencing physical assaults. Knocks and slaps came out of nowhere, leaving bruises and welts on their skin. The Bell family soon realized that they were dealing with a force beyond their understanding, one that was not only malicious, but intelligent. It seemed to know exactly when and how to strike, always leaving them on edge, waiting for the next act of violence. Word of the Bell family's plight began to spread throughout the community. Neighbors who visited the house witnessed the strange occurrences for themselves, objects moving on their own, doors slamming shut, and the eerie sounds of whispering voices that seemed to come from nowhere. Some locals believed the family had fallen victim to a powerful curse, while others thought they were dealing with an angry spirit seeking revenge for some past wrong. As the entity's attacks grew more frequent and more violent, the family became desperate for answers. John Bell turned to friends and neighbors for help, hoping that someone might know how to rid their home of the invisible force. But no one had any solutions. Ministers and pastors were called in to pray over the house, but even their spiritual guidance couldn't stop the torment. The Bell family began to lose hope, feeling as though they were trapped in a nightmare with no way out. The Bell Witch, as the entity had now come to be called, was relentless. It seemed to feed off the family's fear and suffering, growing more powerful with each passing day. John Bell, in particular, seemed to be the primary target. His health began to deteriorate as the constant stress and fear took a toll on his body. His once strong frame became frail, and his hands shook with anxiety. It was clear that the entity wanted something, but what it wanted remained a mystery. Despite the family's efforts to resist, they were losing their battle against the unseen force. The Bell Witch had made its intentions clear. It wasn't going to leave until it had finished whatever dark mission it had come to carry out. And as the attacks on Betsy and John grew more intense, the family couldn't help but wonder if they would survive the ordeal. The torment had already reached unbearable heights for the Bell family, but they were about to discover that the entity haunting their home was far more terrifying than they ever imagined. What had begun as an invisible, violent presence soon revealed itself to be something that could speak, something that could communicate with chilling clarity. It wasn't just a ghost or some mindless force. It was intelligent, cunning, and it had a voice. The first time the entity spoke, it caught the family completely off guard. They had grown used to the eerie knocks, disembodied footsteps, and the unsettling physical attacks. But when the family was sitting quietly one evening, bracing themselves for whatever might come next, a voice filled the room cold, clear, and unmistakably human. It came from nowhere and everywhere all at once, as if the very walls of the house were speaking. "I am here for John Bell," the voice said plainly. The family froze, staring at one another in disbelief. Was this some kind of cruel trick? But no, they all heard it. John Bell's face drained of color. Whatever this thing was, it had just declared that it was targeting him specifically. The air in the room seemed to thicken with dread as the voice continued, sometimes mocking, sometimes angry, but always clear in its hatred for John. The entity called itself Kate, though it later became widely known as the Bell Witch, and it made no secret of its intentions. The voice was unlike anything they had ever experienced before. It wasn't just random murmurs or whispers. It spoke in full sentences, as if it were a living person. It would ask questions, make demands, and even hold conversations with the family and their visitors. What made it even more terrifying was its depth of knowledge. Kate seemed to know things about the Bell family and their neighbors, secrets, events, and details that no one outside the family could have known. It could describe what was happening in other parts of town, as if it had been there itself, watching and listening. The voice also seemed to enjoy tormenting Betsy. It would call her name in the dead of night, whisper cruel things in her ear, and laugh whenever she cried out in fear. It wasn't just content with physical attacks anymore. It wanted to break her spirit, to make her feel hopeless and afraid. The once bright and happy child was now a shadow of herself, living in constant fear of when the voice would speak again, what it would say, and what it would do. John Bell was another favored target of the witch. Kate often berated him, insulting him, and claiming that it had come to end his life. It was as though the entity had a personal vendetta against him. The reasons were never entirely clear, though rumors swirled that Kate Batts, a neighbor with whom John had a falling out over a land deal, had cursed the Bell family out of spite. Whether or not this was true didn't seem to matter. The entity that called itself Kate seemed determined to fulfill its promise. The Bell family's friends and neighbors were initially skeptical of their claims about a talking spirit. But that changed quickly when word spread of the strange occurrences, and people began visiting the Bell household themselves to hear the voice. Ministers, curious locals, and even travelers from neighboring counties came to witness the phenomenon, and none left without being thoroughly shaken by what they experienced. The witch, it seemed, enjoyed the attention, often showing off its knowledge of distant events or entertaining visitors by speaking in different voices and tones. It could imitate the voice of anyone it chose. Sometimes it would even mimic the voices of the family themselves, causing confusion and fear. As the entity continued to speak, it became clear that this was more than just a haunting. It was something far more dangerous. The witch took pleasure in manipulating those around it, bending their will through fear and taunting them with its knowledge and power. The Bell family tried to get help from local ministers, hoping that religious intervention might drive the entity away, but nothing worked. The prayers, the exorcisms, the blessings on the house, none of it made any difference. The voice persisted, as powerful and menacing as ever. And with each passing day, the witch's focus on John Bell grew more intense. It would mock him relentlessly, whispering threats and insults while he went about his daily life. His health, already fragile from the stress of living under such torment, began to deteriorate further. He would wake up in the middle of the night to find himself unable to move, his limbs heavy as though held down by an invisible force. He started suffering from unexplained seizures, his once strong and commanding presence reduced to that of a sickly and terrified man. Despite the terror it inflicted, the Bell Witch's voice wasn't always violent. It had moments of disturbing calm, where it would engage in conversations, sometimes even laughing and joking with visitors. It seemed to enjoy playing with people's emotions, luring them into a false sense of security before turning on them with renewed ferocity. The voice was always unpredictable. One moment, it would be soft and friendly, and the next it would erupt in anger, hurling insults or making sinister threats. The most chilling aspect of the witch's communication was its promise. It had come to take John Bell's life, and it wouldn't stop until it had succeeded. The family was trapped in their own home, with no means of escape from the torment that had invaded every corner of their lives. Each day brought them closer to the grim reality that the witch might indeed be able to carry out its threat. By now, the Bell Witch was not just a local legend, but a phenomenon that had captured the attention of people far and wide. Visitors continued to flock to the Bell farm, seeking answers or hoping to experience the haunting for themselves. But for John Bell and his family, this was no spectacle. It was a living nightmare, and they were all too aware that the witch's promises were not idle threats. The Bell family had now come to understand the true nature of the entity they were dealing with. It wasn't just haunting them, it was targeting them, manipulating them, and working toward a single, terrifying goal. And as John Bell's health worsened, the family could only wait in dread, knowing that the worst was yet to come. As the witch's torment grew more relentless, it became clear that John Bell's days were numbered. The entity that had come to be known as the Bell Witch had made its intentions known from the start. It was determined to take John Bell's life, and now it seemed ready to fulfill that dark promise. Despite the Bell family's efforts to protect him, John's health was rapidly deteriorating, and there was little they could do to stop it. By late 1820, John had become a shadow of his former self. Once a strong and respected farmer, he was now a frail, weak man who could barely leave his bed. The constant stress and fear had taken a toll on him both physically and mentally, and the witch seemed to take delight in watching him waste away. His hands shook uncontrollably, and he struggled to speak or even move at times. The witch's attacks had become more personal, more direct, and more vicious as the weeks wore on. Each day brought new torments. The witch, with its unnerving voice, would whisper cruel taunts in John's ear, reminding him of its power over him. "Your time is near, John Bell," it would say, filling the room with a dark, ominous energy. Sometimes the voice would mock his weakness, laughing at his failing body, while other times it would grow angry and threatening, promising that the end was coming soon. The family could only watch in horror as John's condition worsened. One evening, as the Bell family gathered in John's room, the witch's presence was stronger than ever. They could feel it in the air, thick and suffocating. John lay motionless, his breathing shallow and labored. He had been bedridden for days, and the once vibrant man was now barely recognizable. The room was tense with dread as the witch's voice filled the space again, speaking in low, menacing tones. It declared once more that it had come to end John's life, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The following morning, on December 20th, 1820, John Bell did not wake. Lucy, his wife, was the first to find him lying still in his bed. His breathing had become so faint that, at first, it seemed like he might still be alive. But as she approached, it became clear that he was slipping away. She called for the children, and soon the entire family gathered by John's side, praying for a miracle that would never come. In the midst of their grief, the witch's voice rang out again, cold and triumphant. "I did it. I finished what I came to do." The words hung heavy in the air, and the family was left in stunned silence. The witch had claimed responsibility for John Bell's death, just as it had promised it would. There was no mistaking it now. The entity had carried out its grim mission. The cause of John's sudden decline and death had remained a mystery, but in the days following his passing, the family discovered something chilling. Among John's medicine bottles, they found one that contained a strange, unidentified liquid. No one in the family recognized it, and it hadn't been prescribed by the doctor. Desperate for answers, they tested the substance by giving a small amount to the family's cat. Tragically, the animal didn't survive for long after consuming the liquid, confirming the family's worst fears. This mysterious substance had likely been used to poison John Bell. When confronted with this discovery, the witch's voice erupted in gleeful laughter. "I gave him that potion," it proclaimed, reveling in its victory. There was no longer any doubt that the Bell Witch had been responsible for John's death, using the strange liquid to carry out its fatal plan. It was a devastating realization for the Bell family, who had fought so hard to protect John, only to lose him to the very force they had feared for so long. As the Bell family prepared for John's funeral, the witch continued its disturbing behavior. During this solemn event, while friends and neighbors gathered to pay their respects, the entity made its presence known in a horrifying display. The witch's voice interrupted the proceedings, mocking the mourners, laughing loudly, and making crude jokes at the expense of the grieving family. It was a final, cruel insult, adding a layer of humiliation to the pain and sorrow of John Bell's passing. The family was left devastated, unable to escape the reach of the entity, even in their time of mourning. The death of John Bell marked the culmination of the witch's campaign of terror. For years, the Bell family had endured unimaginable horrors, but now the entity had accomplished what it had set out to do from the very beginning. It had taken John's life, and it had done so with a sense of satisfaction and malicious pride. The family was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, unsure of what would happen next. Yet, as dark as things had become, the witch's influence over the Bell household began to wane after John's death. The violent attacks on Betsy grew less frequent, and the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the farm seemed to lift, if only slightly. The entity, it seemed, had fulfilled its purpose, and with John gone, its presence started to fade. Despite the diminishing torment, the Bell family could never truly move on from what had happened. The memory of John's suffering and the witch's cruel laughter haunted them, even as the physical manifestations of the haunting began to dissipate. For the Bell children, especially Betsy, the scars of those years would last a lifetime. John Bell's death left a mark not only on his family, but on the entire community. The story of the Bell Witch spread far beyond Adams, Tennessee, becoming a legend that would be passed down for generations. People from all over the country would hear the tale of the haunting, of the vengeful witch who had taken the life of a man without ever being seen. Though the entity seemed to have accomplished its goal, the question of why it had chosen John Bell and what truly fueled its hatred remained a mystery, one that would linger long after the haunting had ended. In the wake of John Bell's death, the Bell family hoped that the terror that had gripped their home for so many years might finally be over. The Bell Witch, after all, had achieved its dark purpose. It had taken John's life just as it had promised, and for a while, it seemed that the entity might finally leave them in peace. The violent attacks on Betsy subsided, and the eerie disturbances that had plagued their home began to fade. But even though the immediate threat had diminished, the shadow of the Bell Witch still loomed over the family, the farm, and the entire community. In the months following John Bell's death, the once bustling Bell farmhouse became a place of deep sorrow and quiet reflection. The family tried to rebuild their lives, but the emotional scars left by the witch's torment were too deep to heal easily. Betsy, in particular, had suffered immensely. The physical attacks she had endured were gone, but the emotional trauma lingered. She had been haunted, manipulated, and terrorized by an unseen force that seemed to take joy in her pain. Now, though the witch's voice had gone silent, Betsy was left to grapple with the overwhelming fear and sadness that had become a part of her life. Despite the relative calm that followed John's death, the Bell family couldn't shake the feeling that the witch's presence still lingered, watching and waiting. They continued to hear faint, disembodied whispers from time to time, though the voice was not as aggressive as it once was. It was as if the entity was reminding them that it hadn't truly left, that it still had power over them. For the Bell family, life would never return to the way it had been before the haunting began. The peace they had once known was gone, replaced by the weight of the tragedy they had endured. As time passed, Betsy tried to move forward with her life. She had been engaged to a young man named Joshua Gardner before the haunting escalated, but the strain of the witch's attacks had put their relationship on hold. The entity had made it clear that it disapproved of their union, taunting Betsy about her engagement and even going so far as to threaten Joshua's life. Betsy had been forced to break off the engagement, fearing that the witch's wrath would bring more suffering to those she loved. Even after John Bell's death, Betsy remained hesitant to reconnect with Joshua. She had no way of knowing whether the witch would return if she reignited the relationship. The fear of bringing the entity back into her life was too great, and so she made the difficult decision to move on. Betsy eventually married another man, Richard Powell, a local school teacher who had been a longtime family friend. Though Powell was much older than Betsy, their marriage brought her some measure of stability, and together they left Adams, Tennessee, to start a new life away from the farm that had become a place of nightmares. For the rest of the Bell family, life continued quietly on the farm. Though the Bell Witch's direct attacks had ceased, the farm remained a source of fascination and fear for the local community. Neighbors and visitors would often talk about the haunting in hushed tones, wondering if the witch might one day return. The legend of the Bell Witch grew, spreading far beyond the small Tennessee town. People from neighboring states came to visit the farm, hoping to catch a glimpse of the paranormal activity that had once terrorized the Bell family. As the years went by, the story of the Bell Witch took on a life of its own. The tale of the vengeful entity that had tormented the Bell family and claimed the life of John Bell became a piece of local folklore, passed down from generation to generation. It was whispered around campfires, told in taverns, and shared among friends. Each retelling seemed to grow more fantastical, adding new details and layers to the story. Some claimed the witch was the spirit of a wronged woman. Others believed it was a demon sent to punish John Bell for some unknown sin. The true origin of the Bell Witch remained a mystery, one that no amount of speculation could solve. Despite the enduring fear surrounding the legend, the Bell family's descendants were able to live relatively peaceful lives after the events. Betsy and her husband lived out the rest of their days away from Adams, and though they could never fully escape the memory of the haunting, they managed to build a life free from the witch's influence. The Bell farm remained in the family for generations, though none who lived there ever experienced the same level of terror that John and Betsy had. However, the Bell Witch wasn't entirely gone. Several years after John Bell's death, the entity reportedly returned to the farm for a brief period. It made its presence known by speaking to members of the Bell family, though its tone was far less menacing than it had been during its original reign of terror. It seemed almost playful this time, offering cryptic messages and making predictions about the future. The witch claimed it would return again one day, though it gave no clear indication of when or why. After a short time, the voice disappeared once more, leaving the family in a state of unease. True to its word, the Bell Witch never fully faded from memory. Even though the farm grew quiet again and no further violent hauntings occurred, the legacy of the witch remained firmly entrenched in the town's history. Locals continued to speak of the Bell Witch in reverent tones, warning their children not to venture too close to the old Bell property after dark, for fear that the spirit might still be lingering, waiting for another chance to wreak havoc. The legend of the Bell Witch has endured for nearly 2 centuries, captivating the imagination of those who hear it. Skeptics have tried to explain away the events as superstition or mass hysteria, while believers hold fast to the notion that something truly supernatural took place on the Bell farm. The story has inspired countless books, articles, and even films, solidifying its place as one of America's most famous hauntings. To this day, visitors still come to Adams, Tennessee, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Bell Witch or to feel the lingering energy of the entity that once terrorized a family and captivated a nation. Whether they are true believers or merely curious thrill-seekers, they all leave with a sense of unease, as if the witch's spirit still lingers in the shadows, watching, waiting for the right moment to return. For the Bell family, the memory of those years will never fade. The death of John Bell, the torment of Betsy, and the voice that haunted their every waking moment left a mark that time could never fully erase. Though the witch's physical presence may have waned, its legacy lives on, a chilling reminder of the power of the unknown and the horrors that sometimes lie just beyond the veil of the ordinary. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story on the mysterious and terrifying Bell Witch. Do you believe in the legends? Have you heard other chilling tales that keep you up at night? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Scary Stories, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a spine-tingling tale. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the scariest stories are the ones closest to home. Until next time, stay spooky.